It weighs less than a kilogram. Its frame is corrugated cardboard reinforced with a few strips of fiberglass. A rubber band tensioner holds a brushless motor in place, and a consumer-grade autopilot chip about the size of a postage stamp guides it toward a waypoint someone punched in on a laptop. The whole thing costs somewhere between $200 and $400, depending on how many you order. It flies at roughly 60 knots, slower than a news helicopter, slower than a police chase on a California freeway. Now put it in the Western Pacific, aimed at an Arleigh Burke Flight III destroyer. That ship, the most advanced surface combatant the United States Navy operates, carries the AN/SPW-6 air and missile defense radar, a system so sensitive that program documentation describes it as capable of detecting an object the size of a golf ball from hundreds of miles away. It can track an incoming ballistic warhead falling from the edge of space at Mach 7. Its computers run fire control solutions faster than any human crew ever could. The ship's Aegis combat system is, by almost any definition, the most capable integrated air defense platform ever put to sea. So here is the question that this entire video is built around. And it is a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. If all of that is true, why does a cardboard drone costing $300 force the crew of that billion-dollar warship into a problem they cannot easily solve? The answer is not radar. The answer is not software. The answer is math. A specific, brutal arithmetic that sits at the center of every Pacific deployment decision the US Navy makes today. Stay with this, because the answer is not what most people expect. To understand why the math works the way it does, you need to understand what the Arleigh Burke class actually is. Not the headline version, but the engineering reality underneath it. The Arleigh Burke program began in the mid-1980s as a direct response to the loss of USS Stark. On May 17, 1987, an Iraqi Mirage F-1 fired 2 Exocet anti-ship missiles at the frigate operating in the Persian Gulf. Stark's defenses did not respond in time. 37 sailors were killed. The Navy looked hard at what had gone wrong, not just tactically, but structurally. And the Burke class was shaped in part by what that inquiry found. The first ship, USS Arleigh Burke herself, commissioned in 1991. She carried the AN/SPY, 1D radar, and the Aegis weapon system, MiG-41 vertical launch system cells, and the SM-2 Standard missile as the primary long-range interceptor. The design philosophy was layered. Long-range intercept with SM-2 or later SM-6, medium range with evolved Sea Sparrow, and close-in with the Phalanx CIWS. A 20mm Gatling cannon that fires roughly 4,500 rounds per minute and is designed to function as the last line of defense, the backstop when everything else has already been tried. Over 3 decades and multiple flight variants, the Burke class has grown in displacement, electronics, and cost. The Flight III variant, the current production standard, displaces roughly 9,700 tons fully loaded, carries the SPY-6 radar replacing the legacy SPY-1D, and costs approximately $1.8 billion per hull. More than 70 Arleigh Burke destroyers are currently in commission in the United States Navy, the backbone of every carrier strike group and surface action group operating in the Pacific. What's most surprising about the Burke class is not what it can do. It's the specific constraint that all of that capability shares regardless of which flight variant you're talking about. Every Burke, Flight I through Flight III, carries the same fundamental magazine, 90 to 96 MiG-41 VLS cells. Those cells are fixed. You cannot add more at sea. You cannot 3D print more interceptors in the middle of the South China Sea. When the cells are empty, they are empty. That constraint, not the radar, not the software, is the load-bearing wall of the entire problem. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. Navies have known about magazine limitations for as long as there have been guns on ships. The concept is not new. What changed is the economic equation on the other side of the ledger. Specifically, what it now costs to manufacture something capable of forcing an interceptor out of one of those cells. Let's walk through the cost exchange directly, because the numbers are the argument. An SM-6 Block I missile, the primary long-range interceptor carried by Arleigh Burke Flight III destroyers, capable of terminal-phase ballistic missile defense as well as anti-air warfare, costs approximately $4.3 million per round as of recent procurement contracts. The SM-2 Block Thrice, the older standard missile variant still in the inventory, runs roughly $2.1 million. Even the cheapest interceptor in the VLS magazine costs more per shot than most people will earn in a decade. The drone on the other side of that exchange? The category of cheap, mass-produced, fixed-wing loitering munitions and one-way attack platforms, the kind now manufactured in significant quantities and at rapid scale, costs between a few hundred and a few $1,000s. The specific cardboard and foam variants built around commercial autopilot hardware run at the bottom of that range. Call it $300 to $800, loaded. That is a cost-exchange ratio somewhere between 2, 500 to 1 and 10, 0, 0, 0 to 1, depending on which interceptor you fire and which drone you're firing at. Now run that math against a magazine. An Arleigh Burke in a typical deployment configuration carries a mix of SM-6, SM-2, Tomahawk land attack missiles, and ASROC anti-submarine rockets in its VLS cells. Not all cells are loaded with interceptors. A realistic air defense load might put 30 to 40 SM-6 rounds in the magazine across a given deployment, with the rest of the cells allocated to other mission sets. 30 SM-6 rounds. Against a swarm of drones that can be manufactured for hundreds of dollars each and launched in waves. The logic of saturation is not complicated. You do not need to build a drone that can defeat Aegis. You need to build enough drones that the Burke runs out of expensive interceptors before you run out of cheap attackers. At a $4 million per shot cost, a destroyer expends roughly $120 million in SM-6 rounds, defending against 30 targets. The attacker spends perhaps $40,000 to manufacture those same 30 cardboard airframes. The math runs the wrong way, and everyone in naval planning on both sides of the Pacific knows it. Here's what strikes us about this problem. It is not a failure of American engineering. The SPY-6 radar is genuinely exceptional. The SM-6 is a real-world capable interceptor that has demonstrated hits in testing against ballistic targets, cruise missiles, and surface threats. The Aegis system integration is among the most mature combat management architectures in the world. The problem is not that these systems don't work. The problem is that they work as designed in an era when the cost of the threat has collapsed by several orders of magnitude. The cost per attacking unit, what it takes to force one interceptor out of a VLS cell, dropped from the millions of dollars required to field a credible anti-ship missile in the 1970s and 1980s to the hundreds of thousands of dollars for a cruise missile variant in the 1990s and 2000s to the hundreds of dollars for a mass-produced fixed-wing drone today. That trajectory is not slowing down. If anything, the commercial drone industry and the miniaturization of autopilot hardware is accelerating it. An Aegis destroyer designed to handle the threat environment of 1991 is now being asked to defend against a threat environment its magazine arithmetic was never built for. The reload problem compounds everything. I spent time going through US Navy logistics and readiness documents, public congressional testimony, Government Accountability Office reports, and Navy budget justification books. And one pattern keeps appearing across all of them. The reload bottleneck for VLS missiles at sea is not an edge case. It is a central operational constraint for Pacific deployments. A Burke-class destroyer cannot reload its VLS cells at sea with any current system in the fleet inventory. Reloading requires a return to a port with the appropriate facilities and lifting cranes. In the Western Pacific, the primary reload-capable ports are spread across Japan, Guam, and Hawaii. A destroyer that expends a significant portion of its SM-6 magazine defending against a drone swarm in the South China Sea cannot simply call for a resupply ship and top off overnight. It must transit, potentially several days of sailing, to a facility that can crane new rounds into the cells, then transit back. That transit represents a period during which the ship is operating with a degraded air defense magazine. In a sustained campaign environment, that degradation is not theoretical. It is a planned for operational constraint that shapes how commanders think about committing air defense assets. The Chinese Navy's Type 055 destroyer, the Renhai class, the PLA Navy's most capable surface combatant, carries 112 VLS cells, more than the Burke. Beijing shipbuilders have been producing these hulls at a pace that has drawn consistent attention in Pentagon readiness reports. But the magazine limitation is structural on all modern surface combatants, not unique to American ships. What varies is the cost of the threat environment each fleet is expected to operate within, and the Pacific threat environment has shifted. One detail that stuck with me in the public record: a 2023 Government Accountability Office report on Navy readiness noted that the service had not solved the at-sea VLS reload problem despite years of studies and some concept demonstrations. The technical challenge is real. A MiG-41 canister weighs over a ton, the sea state in the Western Pacific is rarely cooperative, and the crane infrastructure required is substantial. Until that problem is solved, a Burke that expends its magazine is a Burke that must leave the fight. This is the second wall behind the first one. The magazine empties. The reload requires port. The port requires transit. And during that transit, the coverage gap in the defensive scheme has to be filled by something else. Here is where the Phalanx CIWS enters the calculation, and where the problem shifts rather than disappears. The Block 1B Phalanx is a 20mm Vulcan rotary cannon mounted in a white dome-shaped radar and gun assembly that has become one of the most recognizable features of modern US Navy surface ships. It fires a depleted uranium or tungsten penetrator at roughly 4,500 rounds per minute and uses its own onboard radar to track and engage targets autonomously. A Phalanx round costs somewhere between $25 and $60 depending on the type. Against a $300 cardboard drone, that is an interceptor cost that is at least cost competitive and potentially favorable. This is the economic reversal that the analysis usually gets to eventually. Close-in systems like Phalanx can engage cheap drone threats with comparably cheap ammunition. The cost-exchange ratio looks very different when you're firing $25 rounds instead of $4 million missiles. So why not just use Phalanx against the entire drone swarm and preserve the VLS magazine for higher-end threats? Because Phalanx has an engagement envelope. It is a last-ditch, close-in weapon. Its effective range against aerial targets runs to somewhere around 2 kilometers in optimal conditions. Some sources cite effective engagement out to roughly 1.5 nautical miles, while under 2 kilometers in many realistic geometries. A drone swarm that penetrates to Phalanx range has already crossed through the ship's entire outer and middle defensive layers. If you're shooting Phalanx at a drone, that drone is already very close to your hull. More practically, Phalanx carries a finite magazine of its own, approximately 1,550 rounds in the standard configuration. At 4,500 rounds per minute, the gun empties in roughly 20 seconds of continuous fire, against a coordinated multi-axis drone swarm with dozens of airframes arriving from different bearings simultaneously. Even a well-functioning Phalanx system faces a geometry problem. It can slew and engage targets rapidly, but its fire control prioritizes by threat proximity. And a swarm is designed to arrive close to simultaneously and from multiple vectors specifically to create that prioritization problem. The Navy has recognized this. The Rolling Airframe Missile, or RAM, a compact surface-to-air missile also carried on many Burke-class ships in a 21-round launcher, provides a medium-range complement to Phalanx at a per-shot cost of roughly $1 million, lower than SM-6 but still exponentially more expensive than a cardboard drone. Layered defenses help. But each layer has its own ceiling, and the swarm's designers are specifically trying to find the altitude, speed, and volume profile that causes the most expensive layer to respond. The ship does not trade one problem for another. It trades a magazine problem for a range problem. And the range problem is structural to close-in weapons physics in a way that software updates cannot fix. Put yourself in the position of a Burke commanding officer running a war game against this scenario. You have 90-plus VLS cells. Some portion of those are SM-6 or SM-2. You have a Phalanx with 1,500 rounds. You have a RAM launcher. And you are watching radar tracks of 47 slow, low, barely reflective airframes approaching from multiple bearings at 60 knots. Which interceptors do you commit, in what order, and when do you accept that Phalanx and RAM have to carry the remaining engagements? There is no answer to that question that doesn't involve burning expensive assets, accepting risk, or some combination of both. The radar sensitivity question deserves its own examination because the SPW-6 upgrade is genuinely significant, and yet it illustrates exactly why detection capability and defense capability are not the same thing. The AN/SP6V1, the full-scale version integrated into Arleigh Burke Flight III destroyers, provides what Raytheon and the Navy's program documentation describe as a sensitivity improvement of roughly 35 decibels over the legacy AN/SPY-1D. In radar terms, a 35 dB improvement in sensitivity corresponds to roughly a factor of 3,000 in signal strength. The SPY-6 can detect a target that returns 3,000 times less radar energy than the threshold at which the SPY-1D would lose track. That is a meaningful advancement. Against a traditional low observable cruise missile or a small fast attack craft, the detection range improvement is operationally significant. Against a ballistic missile warhead re-entering from space, the canonical hard problem of missile defense, the additional sensitivity provides real margin. Against a slow cardboard drone at 60 knots, the SPW-6 almost certainly detects it. The radar cross-section of a 1 kilogram foam and cardboard airframe is small but not zero. In many conditions, the SP6 will acquire and track it. The crew will know it is there. The problem is not that they can't see it. The problem is what they do after they see it. Here's the take that'll probably generate some pushback. The Navy's radar investments, genuinely impressive as they are, have outpaced the Navy's magazine investments in a way that has created a structural imbalance. Spending in the range of hundreds of millions of dollars to improve the sensitivity of a detection system, while the fundamental reload limitation of the magazine remains unsolved, means you've built a better eye on a body that still has the same number of punches. Seeing the threat more clearly does not change the arithmetic of how many expensive rounds you expend to stop it. The debate inside the Navy, visible in congressional testimony and think tank publications from institutions like the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Hudson Institute, is not whether this trade-off is real. It is. The debate is what the solution set looks like. The two main candidate answers lead in different directions. The first path is to make the expensive interceptors less expensive or more numerous. That means accelerating SM-6 production, investing in cheaper alternatives like the evolved Sea Sparrow Missile Block II for mid-range engagements, solving the at-sea reload problem so that a Burke can top off its magazine without a multi-day port transit, and potentially accepting a smaller mix of higher-end rounds in favour of more mid-range rounds per cell. The at-sea reload problem has received increasing attention from the Navy's logistics commands. Concept demonstrations using lighter vertical replenishment techniques, crane-equipped support vessels, and modular canister designs have been studied. None of these have entered full production. The engineering challenge is genuine. A MiG-41 canister loaded with an SM-6 is a heavy, sensitive, rocket motor-bearing object being transferred between moving ships in ocean conditions that are rarely cooperative. The sea state in the Western Pacific during typhoon season is not a controlled laboratory environment. Until that problem is solved, magazine depth is a fixed parameter in the planning equation, and the attacker who understands that has a structural advantage in how they design their threat architecture. The second path is to push cheap, high-volume weapons forward and accept that VLS missiles are reserved for high-end threats. Under this logic, directed energy weapons, laser systems and high-power microwave emitters become the economically rational answer to the drone swarm problem. A Navy laser system shooting down a cardboard drone costs roughly $1 per shot in electricity. No magazine, no reload, no per-round procurement. The cost-exchange ratio inverts completely. The Navy has been developing directed energy systems for surface ships for over a decade. The solid-state laser. Technology Maturation Program produced several shipboard demonstrators. USS Portland tested a laser weapon system in 2020 and 2021, successfully engaging drone targets. The optical dazzling interdictor, Navy, the Odeon system, has been installed on several Arleigh Burke destroyers as an initial operational capability for counter-drone and counter-sensor missions. But here's what the demonstrations don't fully answer. Laser systems degrade in maritime environments. Salt spray, humidity, atmospheric turbulence, and heavy cloud cover all reduce the effective range and power on target of directed energy weapons. A shipboard laser that works impressively in a clear sky test off the California coast may perform significantly differently in the South China Sea during monsoon season. The physics of beam propagation through humid, particulate-heavy maritime air is a harder problem than the laser power generation challenge. And both problems are not yet fully solved for the ranges and engagement rates that a dense drone swarm would require. So the Navy is caught between two solutions that each come with a ceiling. Expensive missiles drain the magazine and require port to reload. Cheap directed energy weapons have environmental range limits that bring the threat inside its most dangerous proximity to the hull. Each path trades one constraint for another. We looked at hours of Navy budget documents and congressional posture statements trying to find the clean answer to which path wins. There isn't one. Both programs are funded, both are progressing, and the fleet fielding schedule suggests the Navy is hedging rather than choosing. The strategic cost of this arithmetic is measured in operational tempo, specifically in what happens to a destroyer's present schedule when magazine management becomes a primary driver of deployment decisions. A Burke-class destroyer on a typical Western Pacific deployment spends roughly 6 to 8 months forward deployed, cycling through port visits at Yokosuka, Guam, and occasional South China Sea transits as part of carrier strike group operations or independent surface action group patrols. Each transit carries an implicit question. How much of the magazine is consumed per patrol segment, and does the ship need to return to port before the next operational tasking? In a peacetime environment, this question is managed through normal logistics planning. In a contested or elevated readiness environment, the kind of environment that becomes relevant whenever tensions in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea increase, the magazine management problem becomes an acute operational constraint. A carrier strike group operating west of Guam, for example, depends on its Burke-class escort destroyers for layered air defense of the carrier. An aircraft carrier, a Gerald R. Ford-class or Nimitz-class hull, is the most valuable surface asset in the US fleet, representing anywhere from $13 to $16 billion in construction cost for the Ford class, plus the air wing and personnel aboard. The destroyers screening that carrier are the first and primary line of defense against anti-ship threats, including drone swarms. If those destroyers have been tasked through a series of engagements that have consumed significant portions of their VLS magazines, the commanding officer of the carrier strike group faces a direct trade-off: accept degraded escort protection while the destroyers remain forward, or detach destroyers to reload and accept the temporary reduction in screening coverage. Neither option is cost-free. Both represent exactly the kind of operational pressure that an adversary designing a threat architecture around cost exchange is trying to generate. You do not need to sink a Burke to degrade the carrier strike group's effectiveness. You need to force enough Burke magazine expenditure that the strike group commander has to make uncomfortable choices about screening coverage. This is what military analysts mean when they describe the drone swarm as a strategic asymmetric tool. It is not primarily a kinetic weapon. It is a resource management problem delivered at scale. designed to force the more expensive side into a series of decisions where every available option has a cost. So where does the fleet actually stand today, and what is the Navy doing about the cost exchange problem in practice? The fiscal year 2025 defense budget request included continued funding for SM-6 procurement at a rate of around 200 to 250 rounds per year across the Navy's total inventory. That production rate is set against an inventory that has been drawn down by operational commitments, including support to Allied forces in Europe and the Middle East, and a wartime consumption estimate that suggests a high-intensity Pacific conflict could expend the entire available stockpile of certain missile types in days rather than weeks. The Office of the Secretary of Defense has explicitly identified munitions production as a strategic vulnerability. Public congressional testimony from senior Navy and defense officials in 2023 and 2024 repeatedly flagged the gap between projected consumption rates in a peer-competitor conflict and the industrial base's current ability to produce replacement rounds. The Phalanx CIWS line is being upgraded. The Block 1B standard adds a forward-looking infrared sensor that improves engagement of low-observable, slow-flying targets, exactly the drone swarm profile. The Navy has also accelerated evaluation of the AN/SEQ-3 laser weapon system variants and is examining the integration of high-energy laser systems into the Flight III Burke upgrade path. The Type 055 destroyer and the broader PLA Navy surface force, meanwhile, has continued to grow. Beijing shipyards, operating at a capacity that the US Navy's own annual China military power reports have described as vastly exceeding American shipbuilding output, commissioned multiple new destroyers and frigates in the past 2 years. The tonnage gap between Chinese and American annual warship construction output has become a recurring topic in Senate Armed Services Committee hearings. That context matters because the drone swarm problem and the shipbuilding rate problem are connected. A larger adversary fleet, operating closer to its home bases with shorter logistics lines, can sustain magazine attrition pressure on forward-deployed American destroyers more persistently than a smaller fleet could. The arithmetic of cost exchange scales with the operational tempo, and the operational tempo scales with how many hulls each side can put into contested waters. What would you do differently if you were designing the Navy's answer to this problem from scratch? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every one, and the range of solutions people propose is genuinely useful for understanding where the debate sits. Here is the reversal that the whole setup has been building toward. The cardboard drone does not cripple the SPW-6 radar. The radar continues to function. It sees the drone. It tracks the drone. It hands targeting data to the fire control system without any degradation whatsoever. The radar is fine. What the cardboard drone attacks is not the radar. It attacks the economic model that the radar assumes. The SPY-6 was designed to be the sensor layer of a defensive architecture built around the premise that threats are expensive to produce and therefore arrive in manageable numbers. A ballistic missile costs tens of millions of dollars. A cruise missile costs hundreds of thousands. A fighter aircraft costs tens of millions. Against that threat model, a deep magazine of $4 million interceptors makes sense. You are matching an expensive threat with an expensive response, and the math works because both sides are operating at the same cost tier. The cardboard drone is a category violation. It is a threat that costs $300 inserted into a defensive architecture that can only respond with systems that cost 3,000 times more. The radar sees it perfectly. The fire control system tracks it correctly. The crew is well-trained and competent, and yet the response options all involve burning assets far more valuable than the thing being burned against. This is the paradox that the title promised. It is not about the radar failing. It is about the economic logic underneath the radar being invalidated by a shift in manufacturing cost that happened largely outside the naval shipbuilding world. In the commercial drone industry, in the miniaturization of autopilot hardware, in the collapse of cost for brushless motors and lithium battery cells. The most capable radar ever put to sea does not malfunction in the face of a cardboard drone. It functions perfectly. And in doing so, it confirms that the threat is real, trackable, and approaching. Then it waits for a decision that has no clean answer. The Phalanx fires $25 rounds. The laser fires $1 worth of electricity. But both of those systems only engage inside ranges where the threat is already dangerously close, and both have saturation limits of their own. The VLS burns $4 million missiles. But the magazine is fixed, the reload requires port, and the attacker can manufacture another wave for the cost of a used car. The fleet is not broken. The technology is not obsolete. The people operating it are professional and skilled. The problem is structural, and it sits at the intersection of manufacturing economics and weapons architecture in a way that does not have a clean engineering solution. Looking back at how this problem developed, the real question is not whether American technology can detect and track cheap drone threats. It clearly can. The question is whether the economic model of the interceptor, built in an era when threats were expensive and relatively few, can adapt quickly enough to a world where threats are cheap and potentially numerous. The Navy is investing in directed energy. It is investing in higher SM-6 production rates. It is funding at-sea reload research. It is upgrading Phalanx with better sensors and faster slew rates. All of those investments are real, and all of them move in the right direction. But the cardboard drone's economics are also not standing still. Commercial autopilot chips are getting cheaper. Foam and composites manufacturing is scaling up. The trajectory that brought the per-unit cost of a capable loitering munition from millions of dollars to hundreds of dollars has not reached its floor. When the threat costs a few $100s and your interceptor costs several million, does the Navy win by outspending the swarm with missiles and accepting the magazine arithmetic? Or by pushing cheap guns and directed energy forward and accepting that they only work up close? Each path has a price. And the price compounds across every deployment in the Western Pacific, across every carrier strike group escort rotation, across every planning conversation happening right now, between surface warfare commanders and logistics officers trying to figure out how many SM-6 rounds they can afford to expend before they have to turn back toward port. Comment below with which path you think is the right bet. The magazine investment, the directed energy push, or something else entirely. If you want to see how the Navy's shipbuilding rate problem feeds directly into this calculus, why the number of hulls in the water matters as much as what's in any individual hull's magazine, that analysis is coming next. It's a different paradox with the same kind of uncomfortable arithmetic underneath it.